Has setting up your MIDI controller and MIDI mapping in general just been kind of like a monster over your shoulder, always confusing you and overwhelming you? Well, in this video, we're going to dive deep into understanding MIDI so that you can start making the best music you can in your home studio. Hey yo, I'm Alex from MIDI Music, and with this channel, it's my mission to help musicians produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their inner artist in a deeper way. I'll also share videos about tips, tricks, and tutorials about all things music production, just like this one. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. Setting up your MIDI controller and understanding MIDI is so crucial to the modern music production studio environment because your MIDI controller is going to be your best friend. It's a producer's best friend, aside from some coffee, of course. All right, so in this video, I'm going to show you the 5 simple steps to help you set up your MIDI controller and MIDI map inside of Ableton. So let's dive in. All right, so before we dive into actually setting up your MIDI controller with Ableton, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of having a MIDI controller in your setup, because this is going to allow you to actually play the various instruments inside Ableton with your hands, as opposed to having to program everything with your mouse and keyboard. And this is actually going to help you express yourself in a much deeper way, because you're going to connect to your body, right? You're going to get into flow state, your subconscious mind, when you start playing an instrument. All right, I would say that having a MIDI controller is one of the most important things in a modern music production environment, and I would say it's a prerequisite to making the best music you can. All right, so I have a Rolly Songmaker's kit right here, which is actually 3 different MIDI controllers kind of grouped together into one. And I won't get into the details of this MIDI controller because any MIDI controller will do, but I'm going to walk you step by step how to set one up inside of Ableton. All right, so step 1 is to connect your MIDI controller to your computer. Okay, so if you have a MIDI controller that plugs in via USB, you're going to want to go ahead and plug in that USB cable into your computer. If you have a more old school MIDI controller, or you plan on using a synthesizer or something as a MIDI controller, you might have a MIDI out port, and you're going to want to plug in a MIDI cable into that MIDI out port into the MIDI in of your audio interface, and then your computer will be able to receive MIDI data that way. All right, so I'm in Ableton here, and as you can see, I already have a MIDI track created with an instrument loaded, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that real quick. All you have to do is right click in this area here and click Insert MIDI Track. Alternatively, you can go to the drop-down menu of Create and insert MIDI track that way, or you can learn the hotkey, which is Shift-Command-T on Mac to create a MIDI track. But I only need one for now, so I'm going to delete these ones I created. And what I did is simply I just went into sounds and I found a simple grand piano sound. I clicked and dragged it onto this MIDI track. Now it's loaded, so we are ready to demo sounds once we set up our MIDI controller, and our instrument is down here. And finally, before we set up our MIDI controller, make sure that you hit the record arm button here, and that's going to actually allow you to monitor the input of the instrument as you start to play it. Okay, that's super important. And you're going to want to make sure that your monitoring is on auto, which means that all instruments that are record armed will be able to be monitored. Okay, if you turn this off, you won't be able to hear it. And if you turn this on, you'll be able to hear it regardless if this is turned on or off. Okay, but generally you want to keep it on auto. All right, so step 2 is to jump into your Ableton MIDI preferences. All right, so to get there, you can go to Live in the top left corner and then click Preferences, or alternatively, you can learn the hotkey, which is Command, comma on Mac. And then you're going to want to focus on to the Link MIDI tab. Okay, once you find that, just click it. And this is the area where you're going to set up all of your controllers and all of your MIDI preferences. Okay, so this is super important to set up our MIDI controller. And the first thing you want to do is actually check if your controller is a natively supported control surface on Ableton. And what that means is that Ableton actually has certain scripts that pre-recognizes certain controllers. It makes it way easier to set up. So in my example, if I click this drop-down menu, I found Blocks, and this stands for Rolly Blocks, which is the controller I have here. So for this example, my MIDI controller is actually already easily identified by Ableton. So all I have to do is simply click this and Ableton will recognize that it is that MIDI controller. So if you haven't gotten a MIDI controller yet and you're looking for one that's compatible with Ableton, I would suggest that you perhaps consider getting one of these MIDI controllers that have native support inside Ableton. There's a lot of them and it just makes the setup that much easier. If you don't have a MIDI controller from that drop-down menu, no problem. It's super easy to set up a MIDI controller regardless. What you're gonna have to do in that case is go to MIDI ports section of this tab, and it should still be able to be enabled for manual mapping from this menu. If you're using MIDI out from your MIDI controller into your audio interface, you'll simply have to use the MIDI ports section of your audio interface. All right, so now that I've selected my MIDI controller from this drop-down menu, I want to go down to these MIDI ports section at the bottom here, and I want to find my blocks input. All right, so once you find the input setting of your MIDI controller, you're going to want to go ahead and find the track setting and make sure that this is turned on. And what this is going to do is actually allow Ableton to receive MIDI data from your controller. So if this is turned on, you're receiving MIDI. If this is turned off, Ableton is not going to receive MIDI. And then finally, you're going to want to keep in mind that you want remote on. I'm going to turn this off for now because I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but we want to make sure that track is on. And one great way to test to see if Ableton is actually receiving MIDI is to focus your attention to the top right corner of Ableton here. And when it is receiving MIDI, you will see an orange light light up. So I'm gonna go ahead and touch my MIDI controller. Right, so if you look closely, there's some MIDI information coming in when I hit my MIDI controller. But if I go ahead and turn this off and I hit my MIDI controller, you'll notice that nothing is happening. Okay, so that's why the track setting is so important. You have to make sure that this is turned on for your MIDI controller for Ableton to receive data. All right, so once your MIDI controller is set up and you are receiving data, if you set up a MIDI track like I showed you, you can go ahead and test it and play some chords. Beautiful. How awesome is that? So now you can use this MIDI controller for absolutely any sound, any virtual instrument that you find inside of Ableton. Super cool, super powerful. All right, step 3 is custom MIDI mapping. And what you can do inside Ableton is amazing, is you can actually map any parameter of your MIDI controller to control mostly anything inside of Ableton. And this can be super powerful for creating expressive instruments, for controlling effects, or even controlling some more utility-based functions such as the play, stop, and record functions in Ableton. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to set that up. So first of all, we wanna go back to our settings. So I'm gonna hit Command, comma to get there. And again, once again, we wanna get to the Link MIDI tab. So if you recall, we had turned on this track setting, but now we want to focus on this remote setting, and this stands for remote control. And to enable your MIDI controller to control Ableton remotely, you have to make sure this is turned on. All right, so once you have your remote setting turned on, I want you to focus on the top right-hand corner here in Ableton, and you'll see this big MIDI button, okay? So once you hit this button, you'll realize a bunch of things on the screen have a blue selection on top of them. And what this actually allows you to do is control any of those settings with a button, a switch, a fader, anything on your MIDI controller. Okay, so this is super powerful. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and map this play button to this button on my controller. So all you have to do to map this is super simple, is you just simply have to click on what you wanna map and then press the button you wanna map it to. And then Ableton will automatically map it. How easy is that, right? So let's say I wanted to map the stop button to a different button. I'm gonna click here, and I'm gonna hit a different button on my controller, and voila, Ableton automatically maps it. All right, so if I want to now get out of MIDI mode, we'll just go back to the top right-hand corner, click this button, and now we're out of MIDI mapping mode. And now, if I go ahead and hit those buttons I have mapped, it should trigger the play and stop button. All right, so just for fun, I'm gonna record a quick loop here so I can play and stop it. All right, so if you remember, I mapped this button to the play button, and I mapped this button to the stop button. So I'm just gonna push this to play. And I'm gonna hit this button to stop. Awesome. This is just scratching the surface of what's possible by mapping out your MIDI controller, but I highly suggest you play around with this because this will really unlock your workflow to a whole other level. And one pro tip is if you jump back into the MIDI button, you'll notice that on your master fader, there are a few buttons that appear once you enter this mode. And what this actually allows you is, like, let's say you have cursors on your MIDI controller, you can actually map them to move around your session to help you navigate around Ableton. So for example, if I wanted to map this up arrow to a plus button on my controller, I would simply, again, hit this, hit the plus button, and then I'm gonna hit the down arrow, I'm gonna hit the minus button, and now I'm gonna get out of the MIDI map mode. And now when I hit these buttons, you'll notice that it navigates the session view in Ableton. Okay, so this kind of mapping can be super powerful to help you navigate without always having to have your hands on the keyboard and mouse. All right, let's get to step 4. And step 4 is mapping third-party plugins. And third-party plugins are actually extra software that you download externally of Ableton, but that Ableton is totally compatible with. And this is super powerful. There's some amazing plugins out there, but there are slight differences as to how you will map your MIDI controller with third-party plugins. So I'm gonna go ahead and show that to you. So I'm going to select a third-party plugin that I like, and let's go ahead and choose Equator 2, which is a great plugin actually developed by Rolly, the same company who creates these MIDI controllers. So that's super fun. And what I'm gonna do is just open up this synth so you can see it and find a sound that's pretty cool. All right, let's go with the clav on fire. Pretty on fire, pretty cool sound. And let's say I wanted to map my MIDI controller to some of these macro parameters, because these macro parameters actually control parts of the sound. So if I move this, you'll notice it changes the sound. Right, some of them add room, some of them change the tone of the sound. Right, and actually mapping these to some parameters on your controller and playing around with them in real time can really help you open up your creativity and express yourself on a whole other level. All right, so let's go ahead and map some of these macros to our MIDI controller. All right, so I have these 3 faders kind of mapped onto this light pad portion of my MIDI controller here. And what I'm gonna do is map some of these faders to those macro knobs that we wanna control. So the first thing that you're gonna wanna do if you wanna map parameters of a third-party plugin to your MIDI controller is actually go to the instrument of your third-party plugin, right? Go to the device, and you'll notice that there's this little arrow that's actually pointing down. So what you wanna do is hit that arrow, and this whole configure section will appear. And to map parameters of your MIDI controller to the third-party plugin, you just want to simply click on this button, and now Ableton is waiting for you to move the parameters in your third-party plugin that you want to control. So I'm going to go ahead and move this crunch parameter. I'm going to move this lush parameter, and I'm going to move this room parameter. And you'll notice that as I moved those 3 settings, that 3 new fields appeared in this configure section. All right, so once you have done that for the parameters you want to map out, simply just click configure again and get out of that mapping mode. And now that we have these 3 new fields that we've created, we can actually now go back to what we had learned in the last step, is just click the MIDI tab once again, and now you'll notice that these 3 fields are available to be mapped. So what I'm going to do is just click the first parameter. I'm going to move this fader. I'm going to click the second parameter. I'm going to move the second fader. And I'm gonna move to the third parameter and move the third fader. And now I'm gonna go ahead and click that MIDI button once again and get out of MIDI map mode. And now, if I reopen the synth plugin, as I move these faders, those knobs are moving at the same time in sync. So this can be really powerful if you want to, say, play something and adjust some parameters in real time. All sorts of fun possibilities. So another pro tip for you is that if you actually want to save this MIDI mapping you've done to a third-party plugin with your MIDI controller, you can simply go to the device and you can find this little save icon in the top right-hand corner. Simply click that and a new preset field will appear, and you could call this like Roly MIDI map for your MIDI controller. And whenever you want to call those MIDI map settings exactly the way you've mapped them out, simply just load up that instrument and they are good to go. All right, and step 5 is to basically consider all the different options of MIDI controllers and their different functionalities and potential for your workflow and your preferences. So I just want to talk about a few different kinds of MIDI controllers. There is, of course, the MIDI keyboard, which is like a piano, which helps you play instruments. It can help you program beats. You can usually map encoders or faders on those controllers to various things inside of Ableton to really help expand your creativity. However, there are also dedicated MIDI controllers that are just drum pads, and typically these controllers have a little bit more responsiveness for drumming in beats and playing beats. So definitely keep that in mind if you are a rhythmic producer in general, or if you want to explore your drumming side more in depth. Beyond that, there are also MIDI controllers that are mixers and clip launchers, such as what I have over here, the APC 40. So this will actually give you physical faders to help you control the volume of various tracks throughout your session. It'll help you mute, solo, pan tracks. It will help you send your tracks to effects, right? Having a dedicated controller to select tracks, to navigate your session can be super powerful. Many MIDI controllers actually have transport controls baked in, so they allow you to stop, playback, start, playback, navigate your session a little bit. So definitely keep that in mind as you're looking for MIDI controllers. And finally, I just want to talk about one of the holy grail of MIDI controllers that actually changed the game for me, and that's actually the Ableton Push 2. And one great thing about this controller is it was designed by Ableton, and it integrates so seamlessly with the software that it really gives you a hands-on approach to absolutely everything that you can do in the DAW. So it helps you browse your browser, choose samples. You can use it to actually trigger samples and sample audio. You can use it to navigate your session. You can use it to trigger clips. You can use it to play in MIDI data, whether it's drum beats, whether it's melodies. It's a mixer. You can actually do automation. You can add effects. You can do all sorts of things, everything under the sun, and it's hands-on control. And this is really what changed the game for me, because I come from a background of playing instruments and really being hands-on with the creation process. And I always felt a disconnect from the DAW and the software being so heady and having to interface with it with your mouse and keyboard all the time. I felt that really uninspiring. But once I discovered the Ableton Push 2, I realized that many of the features of recording, navigating in the DAW, adding effects, playing in MIDI data could all be done with a hands-on controller. It really changed the game for me because it actually transformed Ableton into an extension of my creativity, an extension of my musicianship, an extension of my personality as a musician, and it really actually just helped me embody all of the features of the DAW by having hands-on control with a MIDI controller. So I actually can't recommend the Push 2 enough, or there are many other Groovebox or all-in-one MIDI controllers that you can find on the market. So I encourage you that if you're inspired by this, definitely check it out. It could actually maybe change the game for you too. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production or have been at this for a while but are having trouble finishing projects, or you just want to see a new workflow to expand your creativity, I actually created a simple 7-step framework that takes you from your absolutely first ideas all the way to a finished master that you can share with the world. And I've also added in some invaluable recording and mixing tips that I've learned throughout the years, and I've baked it all into the simple to follow framework. So if you're interested, go ahead and download that in the description below and have it around your studio. It's super handy for reference and to keep you on track. So let me ask you, what MIDI controller do you use? What MIDI controller do you have your eye on? Let me know in the comments below. All right, so that wraps it up for this video, and I hope to help demystify MIDI and show you the versatility and power of a MIDI controller inside of Ableton. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe for my weekly videos, and we'll see you in the next video.